The autumn wind carried whispers through the streets of Millbrook, Massachusetts, each gust seeming to echo the rumors that had destroyed Emma Carter's life in a matter of days. She stood on the platform of the railway station, clutching a worn carpetbag that contained everything she had left in the world. The morning sun cast long shadows across the wooden planks, but Emma felt no warmth from its light. Just 3 weeks ago, she had been the beloved daughter of the town's most respected schoolteacher. Her father, William Carter, had raised her alone after her mother's death, instilling in her a love of learning and an unwavering sense of integrity. Emma had worked alongside him, teaching the younger children their letters and numbers, dreaming of one day opening a school of her own. The townspeople had smiled at her in the streets, invited her to their gatherings, and spoken of her with genuine affection. Then Marcus Thornwood had arrived. The son of a wealthy Boston merchant, Marcus had seemed charming and cultured when he first appeared in Millbrook's small social circles. He had paid particular attention to Emma, walking with her after church services, bringing her books of poetry, speaking of a future that glittered with possibility. Emma's father had been cautious, warning her that men like Marcus rarely had honorable intentions toward women of modest means. But Emma, at 23 and sheltered in her small-town existence, had allowed herself to hope. The betrayal had been calculated and cruel. Marcus had invited Emma to a private meeting at the town's inn, claiming he wished to discuss a business proposal that would benefit her father's school. Emma, trusting and eager to help, had agreed. She arrived at the appointed hour to find Marcus had arranged a private dining room, insisting they discuss the matter over tea. What Emma hadn't known was that Marcus had also invited several of the town's most influential gossips to accidentally discover them together in what appeared to be a romantic rendezvous. Within hours, the story had spread throughout Millbrook, transformed and embellished with each retelling. By evening, Emma's reputation was in tatters. Marcus, feigning shock and disappointment, had left town the following morning, leaving Emma to face the consequences alone. Her father had believed her, of course, but his support meant nothing against the tide of public opinion. Parents withdrew their children from the school. Former friends crossed the street to avoid her. The whispers followed Emma wherever she went, growing more vicious with each passing day. She saw the pain in her father's eyes each morning, watched as his life's work crumbled around him because of her supposed indiscretion. That was when Emma made her decision. She would leave Millbrook and start anew in New York City, where no one knew her name or her shame. Her father had protested, pressing what little money he had into her hands, but Emma had seen the relief beneath his sorrow. Without her presence, the scandal would fade, and perhaps he could rebuild what had been lost. Now, standing on the platform as the locomotive's whistle pierced the morning air, Emma felt the weight of her choice settle over her like a heavy cloak. She was leaving behind everything familiar, everyone she loved, carrying only her needlework skills and a determination to survive. The city would be vast and indifferent, filled with strangers who owed her nothing, but it would also be a place where she could remake herself, where the past might finally release its grip on her future. As the train pulled away from the station, Emma pressed her face to the window, watching Millbrook disappear into the distance. She did not cry. She had shed all her tears in the dark hours of the night, and now only a cold resolve remained. Whatever waited for her in New York, she would face it with her head held high. The world had tried to break her, but Emma Carter was not so easily destroyed. The journey took most of the day, the landscape shifting from the familiar forests and farms of Massachusetts to the increasingly urban sprawl approaching New York. Emma watched it all with a mixture of fear and fascination. She had never traveled beyond her small corner of New England, had never seen buildings that stretched so high or streets so crowded with humanity. When the train finally pulled into Grand Central Depot, Emma was unprepared for the assault on her senses. The noise was overwhelming. Vendors shouting their wares, locomotives hissing steam, thousands of voices blending into a roar that seemed to shake the very air. The smell of coal smoke and unwashed bodies mixed with the aroma of roasted chestnuts and fresh bread from nearby vendors. People rushed past her in every direction, their faces set with purpose, paying no attention to the young woman standing frozen on the platform. Emma forced herself to move, gripping her carpet bag tighter as she made her way through the crowds. She had an address given to her by a distant cousin who had moved to the city years ago. The boarding house on Mulberry Street was supposed to be respectable and affordable, catering to young women in need of safe lodging. Emma could only pray that it still existed and had room for one more desperate soul seeking refuge. The streets of New York were unlike anything she had imagined. Buildings towered 6 and 7 stories high, blocking out much of the afternoon sun. Horse-drawn carriages and wagons competed for space on cobblestone streets, slick with recent rain. Women in fashionable dresses picked their way carefully along sidewalks, lifting their skirts away from the mud and refuse that gathered in the gutters. Street vendors called out in languages Emma didn't recognize, adding to the overwhelming cacophony. Emma walked for what felt like hours, stopping frequently to check the crumpled paper with her cousin's directions. The neighborhoods changed around her, from the grandeur near the depot to increasingly cramped and shabby streets. Finally, she found herself standing before a narrow brick building wedged between a butcher shop and a laundry. A faded sign proclaimed it as Mrs. O'Brien's boarding house for respectable ladies. She climbed the steps and knocked, her heart pounding with exhaustion and apprehension. The door opened to reveal a plump, red-faced woman in her 50s, wiping her hands on a flour-dusted apron. Mrs. O'Brien's sharp eyes took in Emma's appearance in a single sweeping glance. "You look half dead on your feet, girl," Mrs. O'Brien said, her Irish accent thick but not unkind. "Come in before you collapse on my doorstep." Emma stumbled inside, grateful beyond words for the warmth and the smell of something cooking in the back rooms. Mrs. O'Brien led her to a small parlor and pressed a cup of tea into her hands. "Now then," the landlady said, settling her substantial frame into a chair opposite Emma, "let's hear your story, and don't bother lying. I've heard every tale a girl can tell, and I know the truth when I hear it." Emma hesitated, then began to speak. She told Mrs. O'Brien everything, from Marcus's betrayal to her father's heartbreak to her desperate flight to the city. When she finished, tears were streaming down her face, despite her best efforts to remain composed. Mrs. O'Brien was quiet for a long moment, studying Emma with an expression that might have been sympathy or might have been assessment. Finally, she nodded. "I have a room," she said simply. "Small but clean, $3 a week, including breakfast and supper. You'll need to find work quickly. I don't run a charity, but I believe you're telling the truth, and I think you've got steel in you, even if you don't know it yet." Emma felt something loosen in her chest, the first stirring of hope she had experienced in weeks. "Thank you," she whispered. "I promise I won't disappoint you." "See that you don't," Mrs. O'Brien replied, but her tone was almost gentle. "Now come along. Let's get you settled before supper. Tomorrow we'll talk about finding you employment. New York's got no patience for the weak, but it's got opportunities for those willing to work for them." As Emma followed the landlady up narrow stairs to a tiny room under the eaves, she felt the first flicker of something that might eventually become courage. She had survived the worst days of her life. Now she would learn to do more than survive. She would learn to live again. Emma's first weeks in New York passed in a blur of exhaustion and discovery. She quickly learned that Mrs. O'Brien's boarding house was home to 7 other young women, each with her own story of hardship and hope. There was Bridget, a chambermaid at one of the grand hotels uptown, who sent half her wages back to her family in County Cork. Mary worked in a textile factory, her fingers perpetually stained with dye. Sarah was a shop girl at a department store on Broadway, and Lucy cleaned offices in the financial district before dawn each morning. At first, the other women regarded Emma with polite but distant curiosity. They had seen too many girls arrive full of dreams, only to be crushed by the city's harsh realities. But Emma's quiet determination and willingness to help with household chores gradually earned their respect. Within a week, she felt less like an outsider and more like part of an unlikely family bound together by shared struggles. Finding employment proved more challenging than Emma had anticipated. Her skills as a teacher meant nothing in a city where educated women from good families competed fiercely for the few respectable positions available. Without references or connections, doors closed in her face before she could even state her qualifications. Department stores wanted experienced shop girls with local knowledge. Schools wanted teachers with impeccable credentials and family backgrounds that could be verified. It was Bridget who finally suggested the solution. "You're handy with a needle, aren't you?" she asked one evening as they sat darning stockings in the boarding house parlor. "I've seen the way you've mended your own things. That's skilled work, that is." Emma nodded slowly. Her mother had been an excellent seamstress, and Emma had learned at her knee, though she'd never considered it more than a useful household skill. "I suppose I am," she admitted, "but I've never sewn professionally." "Doesn't matter," Bridget said firmly. "There's a tailor shop on Broome Street, run by a man named Mr. Goldstein. Jewish fellow, very particular about his work, but fair. He's been looking for someone to help with the detail work. His eyesight's not what it was, and his daughter, who usually helps, is expecting her 4th child. Go see him tomorrow. Tell him Bridget O'Malley sent you, and that I vouch for your needlework." The next morning, Emma found herself standing outside a narrow shop front, squeezed between a bakery and a cobbler's workshop. Through the window, she could see bolts of fabric stacked high on shelves, and an elderly man bent over a cutting table, spectacles perched on his nose as he worked with careful precision. She gathered her courage and pushed open the door, setting off a small bell that announced her arrival. Mr. Goldstein looked up, his expression neither welcoming nor hostile, merely waiting. "Mr. Goldstein?" Emma said, her voice steadier than she felt. "My name is Emma Carter. Bridget O'Malley suggested I come to see you about work. She said you might need someone with needlework skills." The old man's eyebrows rose slightly. "Bridget sent you? She's a good girl, that one. Always pays her bills on time." He set down his shears and gestured toward a small piece of fine linen on the counter. "Show me." Emma approached the counter, where she found needles and thread laid out beside the fabric. A pattern was marked faintly on the linen, a delicate design of leaves and flowers. Without hesitation, Emma selected the appropriate thread and began to work, her fingers moving with the practiced ease her mother had taught her so many years ago. Mr. Goldstein said nothing, but she could feel his eyes on her hands, assessing every stitch. The shop was quiet, except for the distant sounds of street traffic and the rhythmic click of her needle. When she finished a small section of the pattern, Emma looked up to find the tailor nodding slowly. "Your stitches are even, and your tension is good," he said. "Not perfect, but good enough to learn from. I can pay you $4 a week to start, $5 if you prove yourself reliable. The work is detail finishing, alterations, and decorative elements. Hours are 7 in the morning until 6 in the evening, half day on Saturdays, closed Sundays. You'll start Monday." Emma felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. "Thank you, Mr. Goldstein. I won't disappoint you." "See that you don't," he replied, echoing Mrs. O'Brien's words from days before. "New York has no shortage of girls looking for work, but Bridget's word means something to me, so I'm giving you a chance. What you do with it is up to you." Emma left the shop feeling lighter than she had in months. $4 a week wasn't much, but with Mrs. O'Brien's $3 for room and board, she would have $1 left for other necessities. More importantly, she had found honest work that made use of her skills. It was a beginning, small but real. Monday morning found Emma at the tailor shop promptly at 7, ready to learn. Mr. Goldstein introduced her to his world of fine fabrics and exacting standards. He showed her how to make stitches so tiny they were nearly invisible, how to finish seams so they lay flat and perfect against the body, how to attach buttons so they would last for years of wear. Emma absorbed every lesson with fierce concentration, determined to prove herself worthy of this opportunity. The work was demanding, requiring hours of careful focus that left her eyes aching and her fingers cramped. But there was something deeply satisfying about transforming pieces of fabric into beautiful garments, about knowing that her skilled hands were creating something of value. Mr. Goldstein was exacting but patient, quick to correct mistakes, but equally quick to acknowledge good work. Within 2 weeks, Emma had established a rhythm. She rose before dawn to help Mrs. O'Brien with breakfast, walked the 20 minutes to the tailor shop, worked through the day with only a brief break for the lunch she brought from home, then returned to the boarding house for supper and an evening of mending or reading before bed. It was a simple life, but it was hers, earned through her own efforts. The other women in the shop became familiar faces. There was Julia, a spirited Italian girl with dark curls and a quick laugh, who worked as a presser, wielding the heavy irons that smoothed finished garments. She had grown up in the neighborhood and knew everyone's business, sharing gossip and stories that made the long hours pass more quickly. Despite Julia's sometimes brash manner, Emma found herself drawn to the girl's warmth and genuine kindness. "You're too quiet, Emma," Julia would say, nudging her playfully. "A pretty girl like you shouldn't hide in the shadows. You need to live a little, have some fun." But Emma wasn't ready for fun. The wounds from Millbrook were still too fresh, the fear of trusting too easily still too strong. She kept her head down, focused on her work, and tried to build a life from the broken pieces of her past. One afternoon in late November, a distinguished-looking gentleman entered the shop, accompanied by a younger man who appeared to be his secretary. The gentleman was tall and impeccably dressed in a dark suit that even Emma's untrained eye could recognize as extraordinarily expensive. His bearing suggested both wealth and breeding, yet his expression was weary, as though he carried burdens invisible to casual observers. "Mr. Goldstein," the gentleman said with a slight accent Emma couldn't quite place. "English, perhaps, or something similar. I require several alterations to my wardrobe. My previous tailor has retired, and I was told your establishment maintains the highest standards." Mr. Goldstein bowed slightly, a gesture of respect between craftsmen. "You were told correctly. May I ask who provided the recommendation?" "Mr. Vanderbilt, actually. I'm staying at his residence temporarily while conducting business in the city." Emma's hands stilled on her work. A friend of the Vanderbilts. This was a client of extraordinary importance. Mr. Goldstein's face remained professionally neutral, but she could see the slight tension in his shoulders that indicated he understood the significance of this moment. For the next hour, Emma watched as Mr. Goldstein took measurements and discussed the required alterations with exquisite attention to detail. The gentleman, whom she heard addressed as "Your Grace" by his secretary, suggesting an aristocratic title, was patient and precise in his requirements, clearly someone accustomed to the finest quality in all things. As the consultation concluded and the gentleman prepared to leave, his eyes swept across the shop, taking in the busy workers and neat organization. For just a moment his gaze met Emma's, and she saw something flicker in his expression. Curiosity, perhaps, or merely polite acknowledgement. Then he was gone, leaving only the lingering scent of expensive cologne and the memory of a presence that somehow seemed larger than life. "Well," Julia whispered as soon as the door closed, "that was the Duke of Kensington, if I'm not mistaken. English nobility, richer than sin and not bad to look at either, even if he does seem rather somber." Emma bent her head back to her work, trying to ignore the strange flutter in her chest. Dukes and aristocrats had nothing to do with her world. She was just a seamstress trying to survive in an unforgiving city, and she would do well to remember that. But as the afternoon light faded and she carefully stitched delicate buttonholes into a fine linen shirt destined for that same gentleman's wardrobe, Emma couldn't quite shake the memory of those penetrating eyes or the feeling that something significant had shifted in the careful, quiet life she was building. The alterations for the Duke of Kensington became Emma's primary project over the following week. Mr. Goldstein entrusted her with the detailed finishing work, explaining that the quality of these garments must exceed even their usual exacting standards. Emma approached each task with meticulous care, aware that her work would be scrutinized by someone accustomed to perfection. She learned from Julia's gossip and the newspapers she now occasionally purchased that Arthur Kensington, the Duke of Kensington, was in America exploring investment opportunities in the railroad industry. Widowed 5 years prior, he had left his young son in England under the care of trusted relatives while he attended to business matters abroad. He was known for his keen business acumen and his reserved, almost melancholy demeanor, a man who seemed to carry grief like a constant companion. Emma found herself thinking about him more than was wise or appropriate. She told herself it was merely curiosity, a natural interest in someone so different from anyone she had ever encountered. But late at night, lying in her narrow bed under the eaves of Mrs. O'Brien's boarding house, she would remember the way his eyes had briefly met hers and feel a strange warmth that had nothing to do with curiosity. The summons came on a bitterly cold December morning. Mr. Goldstein called Emma to the front of the shop, where the Duke's secretary stood waiting. "His Grace requires a consultation regarding some additional work," the secretary explained in clipped, efficient tones. "Mr. Goldstein is unable to leave the shop at present, so he has suggested that Miss Carter might come in his stead, as she has been doing the detailed work on His Grace's wardrobe." Emma's eyes widened. "Me? But I'm only an apprentice seamstress. Surely—" "You have good eyes and skilled hands," Mr. Goldstein interrupted, "and His Grace specifically mentioned being impressed by the quality of the buttonholes on his linen shirt. This is an opportunity, Emma. Don't let fear prevent you from seizing it." 20 minutes later, Emma found herself in a handsome cab traveling uptown to the Vanderbilt mansion on Fifth Avenue, her work basket on her lap and her heart pounding with anxiety. She had never been to this part of the city, where massive mansions proclaimed their owners' wealth with ostentatious architecture. The Vanderbilt residence was particularly imposing, a palace of limestone and marble that would have housed half of Millbrook's population. A stern-faced butler led her through halls filled with gilt and crystal, up a grand staircase, and finally to a well-appointed sitting room where the Duke of Kensington stood by a window, gazing out at the winter landscape of Central Park. He turned as she entered, and Emma was struck again by the weariness in his eyes, the sense that this man was somehow removed from the magnificence surrounding him. "Miss Carter," he said, and she was surprised that he remembered her name. "Thank you for coming. I apologize for the irregular summons, but I have a matter that requires someone with particular expertise, and Mr. Goldstein suggested you might be able to assist." He gestured toward a chair where several garments lay carefully arranged. Emma approached, her professional instincts overriding her nervousness as she examined them. They were beautiful pieces, clearly of English manufacture, but she could see immediately what the problem was. The embroidery on a waistcoat had come partially undone, and a dress shirt had a small but noticeable stain near the collar that previous cleaning attempts had failed to remove. The waistcoat was my wife's last gift to me before she passed, the Duke said quietly. I would very much like to preserve it if possible. The shirt I care less about, but it's part of a set, and I'm told you have skill in such matters. Emma touched the waistcoat gently, seeing now that the embroidery was a delicate pattern of forget-me-nots worked in silver thread. Her heart ached for this man's loss, recognizing in his careful preservation of this garment the same love her father had shown for her mother's belongings. I can repair the embroidery, she said softly. It will take time and very careful work, but I believe I can make it almost indistinguishable from the original. As for the shirt, there are techniques for removing such stains without damaging the fabric. I would like to try, if you trust me with it. The Duke's expression softened slightly. Mr. Goldstein said I could trust you. I'm beginning to see why. They discussed the details of the work, and Emma was surprised to find herself conversing easily with this aristocrat who should have been completely beyond her sphere. He asked her opinion on various aspects of the repair, listening to her responses with genuine interest. When their business was concluded, he walked her to the door himself, rather than summoning a servant. Miss Carter, he said, as she prepared to leave, may I ask an impertinent question? Emma's heart skipped. Of course, Your Grace. You're clearly educated beyond what one typically finds in a seamstress. Your speech, your bearing, they speak of a different background, and yet here you are, working in a tailor shop. I don't mean to pry, but I confess myself curious. For a moment, Emma considered deflecting, offering some polite fiction. But something in the Duke's eyes, a shared understanding of loss perhaps, made her choose honesty instead. I was a teacher, she said simply, in Massachusetts. Circumstances beyond my control made it necessary for me to start anew in New York. Mr. Goldstein gave me an opportunity when others would not. I'm grateful for it. The Duke nodded slowly. Starting anew is something I understand well. The past can be both a burden and a teacher, can it not? Yes, Emma whispered. Yes, it can. Then I wish you well in your new beginning, Miss Carter, and I look forward to seeing what your skilled hands can accomplish with my waistcoat. As Emma rode back downtown in the cab the Duke had insisted on providing, she felt something shifting inside her. For the first time since leaving Millbrook, she felt seen, not as a fallen woman or a desperate seamstress, but as a person of worth and capability. It was a fragile feeling, one she hardly dared to trust, but it warmed her nonetheless. The work on the waistcoat took Emma 3 weeks of painstaking effort, working late into the evenings by lamplight in her room at the boarding house. Each stitch had to be placed with perfect precision to match the original pattern. She sourced matching silver thread from 3 different suppliers before finding exactly the right shade. Slowly, meticulously, the forget-me-nots bloomed again under her careful fingers. When she finally returned the completed waistcoat to the Vanderbilt mansion, the Duke's reaction was worth every hour of effort. He held the garment carefully, examining the repaired embroidery with something approaching wonder. Miss Carter, he said, his voice thick with emotion, you've done more than repair fabric and thread. You've restored something I thought lost forever. I'm deeply grateful. He insisted on paying her double what they had agreed upon, and no amount of protest would change his mind. But more valuable than the money was what he said as she prepared to leave. I would like to engage your services for other special projects if you're willing. I have several items that require the sort of skilled care you've demonstrated. And Miss Carter. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. I hope you won't think me too forward if I say that I believe New York is fortunate to have you. Your past may have brought you here, but your talents will surely build your future.